My Lords, I begin by thanking the Noble Lord Scriven for securing this important debate, and I have to say I'm honoured to take part in this debate with the Noble Lady Baroness Grey-Thompson, who gave a very important speech, and with her I share great concern about women's sport, how far we have to go towards equality, and also the understanding that we can go backwards as well as forwards, which is something that's sometimes forgotten. And I'd also credit the Noble Lord Thomas of Gresham for acknowledging having changed his mind. It's something that is always good to see in your Lordship's house, people's thinking, developing and going forward. But I'm going to start by going a long way back to a couple of the origins of sporting activity thousands of years ago. One of those was the ancient Olympics, which were held in the honour of Zeus, who for the ancient Greeks was the despotic, sexually abusive king of the gods on Mount Olympus. If you go to Mesoamerica, the Mesoamerican ball game, sometimes positively it seems to have been used as an alternative for war. Toplitzin, the Toltec king, played it against three rivals, with the winner getting to rule over the losers. But later in the history of the ball game, it came to be associated with human sacrifice, usually decapitation. Blood-soaked sport indeed. But I looked up the origins of the actual term as we currently use them, sportswashing, and it seems to have begun in 2015 when Azerbaijan used the European Games to divert international attention away from human rights in that country. And I think we have to, as the Noble Lady Baroness Grey-Thompson did, draw the parallel between greenwashing and sportswashing. Something that's associated with health, with democracy and equality, even with environmental action. These are all positives that are churned up together and supposed to put out something good. But so often what we're talking about is a very thin coat over some very nasty very nasty things underneath. Now, I think it's worth looking at where in the UK the term first perhaps widely became used, and I think that's probably 2018, regarding Abu Dhabi, the Manchester City football team, and the case of Matthew Hedges, a PhD student who was convicted of spying in the UAE, subsequently, eventually, after a great deal of suffering, later pardoned. What we saw was lots of Manchester City supporters coming out defending the UAE and human rights in the UAE because they wanted to defend their football team. And I think that's a very interesting example of the way in which sport can be used, literally as a lever, as a tool. And Amnesty International, I think, was particularly effective in highlighting that at the time. But I think to come closer to the current day and think of a moment when sports washing totally became untenable, and that was the moment when UEFA decided to move the Champions League final from St. Petersburg, President Putin's hometown, in 2022. That, of course, was after the illegal invasion of Ukraine by the Russian regime. But that was after extensive sports washing of what was already very obviously authoritarian and internationally aggressive regime that might be taken as having been at its peak in the 2018 World Cup. The president of FIFA at the Kremlin declared that the world was now in love with President Putin. What kind of image does that look like now? But even at the time, it wasn't hard to see how disturbing that was. And Rio Ferdinand and Peter Schmeichel were actually also at that meeting. Going back a little bit further to 1978 World Cup in Argentina, the military junta 2 years before has seized power. And then the Argentine team won the cup, and that was seen as a real political boost for the junta that helped to keep it in power. So coming forward back again to 2022 and the World Cup in Qatar, which truly was blood-stained, a mark of shame on the so-called beautiful game. When Qatar won the World Cup in 2010, the right to stage it, it only had one of the 8 stadiums needed. To build the rest and the hotels and the roads, Human Rights Watch reported that more than 2 million migrants were forced to work in sweltering heat, in extremely abusive labour conditions, being abused in the interests of sport, and of course money, and I'll come back to that money point later. And it was reported that at least 6,500 migrant workers died through those 10 years of construction. We're not really that far from the Mesoamerican ball games, are we? Now, this is a country, of course, where the migrant workers and other residents, should they be LGBTIQA+, face severe repression of their basic human rights, as do many other people. And this, of course, is despite the fact that FIFA is signed up to the UN Principles on Business and Human Rights, which they did in 2016, requiring it to, quote, avoid infringing on the human rights of others, close quote. Now, the Noble Lord Scriven spoke extensively about the situation in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. I won't go back over the entire ground that the Noble Lord covered, but I think it is worth looking at the total list. There has been an explosion of sports washing by Saudi Arabia, spending at least $6.3 billion in sports washing since 2021. That's 300 sponsorship deals, the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, chaired by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and the state-owned oil company, we come back to that link between environment and sport, have invested in sports such as boxing, racing, football, snooker, golf, ATP tennis, cricket, America's Cup regatta, and they're sports washing what is an increasingly repressive regime. The regime, of course, that continues to intervene in Yemen, one of the world's worst human rights crises, and that was responsible for the murder of the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Now, I'm also going to briefly revisit, as the Noble Lord Scriven did, the situation of Bahrain, and particularly Formula One. The regime has regularly used the Grand Prix to enhance its image, and over the past 2 decades, as the Noble Lord outlined, there have been numerous human rights violations directly associated with the actual event itself. We are coming back to bloodstains again. And I will raise, as the Noble Lord did, specifically the case of Saeed Hashem Al-Wadi, the son of Hajim Mansour, and to ask the government, I'm aware it's not directly in the Noble Lord's portfolio, but nonetheless I think in this context the Noble Lord must have expected this question about what the government is doing in that situation. And I would ask the Noble Lord whether he would actually continue to defend the fact that on the 2nd of March 2024, the UK ambassador to Bahrain, Alastair Long, released a promotional video celebrating 20 years of F1 in Bahrain, saying this is vision this took from His Majesty and His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, close quote, boasting of Bahrain UK tourism ties, completely ignoring human rights abuses and actively sports washing the regime. I remain your Lordship's house. This is the UK ambassador to Bahrain. Does the Noble Lord consider that is acceptable? Now, an obvious part of this debate on sports washing is the place of boycotts, as raised by the Noble Lord, Lord Moynihan. And it does have to raise the impact of the sports boycott on apartheid South Africa. And I very much agree with the Noble Lord that the sports boycott was only part of the story, but it was nonetheless, I think it's an important part of the story. And here I have to cross-reference what's known as generally as the anti-boycotts bill that the government is currently pushing through your Lordship's house, formerly the Economic Activity of Public Bodies (Overseas Matters) Bill. Now, the Noble Lord, Lord Hayne, not currently in his place, spoke extremely powerfully at the second reading of that bill. I'd urge Noble Lords who haven't to read that speech, and also writes in today's Guardian about the power of sports boycotts and also the power of local action when the national government was failing to take action. As the Noble Lord Haynes says in The Guardian, the British people's international solidarities have often exceeded those of our political leaders. And that doesn't, however, absolve the government from action. And Noble Lords have only covered, there is so much issues around the place of oppressive regimes in British sport today. So a direct question to the Noble Lord, the Minister: what steps will the government take to ensure that multi-billion-dollar companies based in the UK are not actively engaged in covering up human rights abuses through their sports-related activities and actively sports-washing, making regimes have a more positive appearance? And a second question, going back to the issue of Saeed Hashim: what steps will the government take to ensure the release of Saeed Hashim? Now, finally, and here I will agree with the Noble Lord, Lord Moynihan, that sport is only a small part of this story. Finance is a big part of the story of the ways in which repressive regimes have infiltrated our society, used elements of our financial sector, other elements of our society to make themselves appear respectable. From my entry into the House, I've talked about the corruption of the London laundromat, the still partly hidden scandal of golden visas, our role as butler to the world's kleptocrats and populists, a term I've borrowed from the Noble Lord Brown of Ladyton, who had a speech of that title in February 2022 in your Lordship's House. It can sometimes seem that sport is small beer in comparison to that wave of corruption that we've invited into the UK, the wave of covering up of human rights abuses, of corruption that's occurred through the City of London, through other British mechanisms. But I come back to the point that the plutocrats, the autocrats, they're people too. They seek acceptance. They seek gilding on tarnished reputations. They seek fake legitimacy. And sport is something that has a very special ability to provide that, and we have to acknowledge that.
My Lords,